Welcome to the deep dive. We're really so glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. We have a genuinely fascinating journey to go on.
We really do. And it actually starts with a rather striking statistic from our source material. Get this, over 90% of the world's population believes in God or some kind of higher power.
90%, that's a staggering number.
It is staggering. And yet, when you really stop to think about it, we almost never examine the actual deeply personal mechanics of that spiritual journey.
Right.
Not without getting totally bogged down in rigid dogma or, institutional rules.
It's so true. It is this massive shared human experience that is surprisingly difficult to talk about openly. I mean, the actual day-to-day mechanics of belief of seeking something greater than yourself are so often overshadowed by the sheer weight of the organizations built around them.
Yeah,
People tend to talk about the building they sit in rather than the internal transformation they are actually experiencing.
exactly. Which is why we are exploring something completely different today. We're pulling from an incredible YouTube interview from Steve Reed's channel. It's called Partner with God for Peace and Prosperity.
Great channel.
Yeah, and Steve has this series called Let's Discover God Together. The subject of this particular interview is a man named Bob Ingle.
Right. Bob is a musician, a blogger, and a former deeply embedded church leader.
Yes. And our mission for this deep dive is to follow Bob's decades-long journey. It is this raw, profound story about moving away from rigid religious structures to find a beautifully messy, real-world spirituality.
What stands out immediately about the source material is that this isn't simply a story about religion. It serves as a deeply compelling case study in how we as human beings seek meaning.
Mm-hmm.
It explores how we construct boundaries to feel safe, and then inevitably how we outgrow those boundaries to find something more authentic. It's a pattern you can apply to almost any major life transition.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Bob's story starts with some serious early friction.
Hmm.
Bob grew up in the 1950s, raised by a single Christian mother.
Right.
His father actually left when Bob was only 3 years old, driven away by what Bob describes in the interview as women and the bottle.
Wow.
But his mother was a remarkable force, and Bob grew up deeply embedded in the Baptist church. We were talking perfect Sunday school attendance for 7, 8, 9 years straight. He was practically a fixture in the building.
Until he hit age 15.
Right, till age 15.
Age 15 is often that critical juncture where young people start observing the actions of adults with a much more critical eye, and Bob's breaking point arrived over politics.
This part is wild.
His church began actively praying against a presidential candidate from New England. And the striking part is that they weren't praying against him because of his political party or his policies. They were praying against him simply because the candidate was Catholic.
And Bob had Catholic friends at school. He just couldn't reconcile the disconnect between the love he was being taught in Sunday school and the targeted prayers he was hearing in the sanctuary.
It didn't add up for him.
Not at all. So at 15, he walked away. He started sitting in his car in the parking lot during church, listening to Top 40 radio instead.
Which is such a vivid image of rebellion, but also of a search for something that felt real to him.
Exactly.
Oh.
So fast forward a bit to when he's 19 years old. He's been away at college, he's playing rock and roll for a living, and he decides to try going back to his home church.
He actually makes an effort.
He does. He puts on a jacket and tie, shows up on a Sunday morning, and is immediately stopped in the lobby by a young deacon.
The deacon recognizes him and essentially issues an ultimatum right there in the foyer.
Right there.
He points out that Bob was out playing rock and roll in a bar the night before, and he tells him flat out that he cannot play in a bar on Saturday night and expect to come to church on Sunday morning.
And Bob has this incredibly memorable internal realization in that exact moment. He realizes, and this is the direct quote, he says, "There's a lot more rock and roll in my soul than there is Calvinism."
It's a brilliant realization.
Isn't it? He's basically realizing that his free-spirited, musically driven nature simply couldn't survive in a theology built around strict predestination and rigid predetermined rules. He was being handed a choice between his authentic self and the institution's requirements.
And he chose his authentic self. He walked away again, and he stayed away for over a decade. And that brings us to a massive climax in July of 1977.
Yeah.
Bob is 32 years old. By all outward metrics, he is winning at life. He has a good marriage, he has kids, he's making excellent money in sales.
American dream, basically.
Exactly. But internally, he is experiencing severe, crushing depression. It gets so incredibly dark that he finds himself sitting on the edge of his bed holding a borrowed .357 Magnum pistol.
A doctor friend had asked him to hold on to the gun while he was away.
Right. And Bob is sitting there in the quiet of his bedroom, seriously contemplating ending his own life. In that incredibly dark, isolated moment, he prays this desperate, completely unpolished prayer. He just says, God, you're going to have to help me. I can't handle this anymore.
It's such a stark contrast to the performative religion of his youth.
Mm.
There is no theological jargon, no formal posture. It's just pure desperation.
What's fascinating here is that his profound spiritual reset didn't happen in a pew or during a carefully orchestrated church service.
No.
It happened in a moment of total, unvarnished surrender at his absolute lowest point. He described the immediate aftermath as feeling like he'd been born with an invisible anvil on his back, and he didn't even know it was there until that precise moment when it was suddenly lifted off.
I think about that invisible anvil, and for you listening right now, this is such a universal connection point. We all have these moments, or even entire seasons of life, where our outward success completely masks our internal despair. You might be crushing it at work, hitting all your targets, smiling in all the family photos, but carrying this crushing weight that no one else can see. Bob's story really highlights this deeply human need to just drop the facade and ask for help, whether you know exactly who you're asking or not.
The vulnerability of just admitting you are at the end of your own strength is often the catalyst for real change. And the immediate aftermath of that moment completely shifted the trajectory of his life. A client actually noticed the change in his demeanor a few days later, pulled a King James Bible out of his desk, and became Bob's mentor.
Which launches Bob and his wife Flo into what we can really call the all-in years.
Yeah, they went deep.
They really did.
Yeah.
Because Bob and Flo, as he describes it, were the kind of people who were all in or not at all. They jumped headfirst back into church life. Over the next few decades, they were deeply embedded in the infrastructure.
Teaching, leading.
Yeah, Bob was teaching Sunday school, playing lead guitar on the worship team, leading new believer classes. But even while acting as a pillar of the community, Bob kept hitting these structural walls.
The friction of dogma started to chafe again. He eventually had to step away from teaching at a Baptist church because he reached the Book of Acts in his curriculum.
Right.
And he realized he couldn't, in good conscience, teach their strict doctrine that the gifts of the Spirit weren't meant for the modern day. For context, these gifts refer to the idea that miraculous elements or spontaneous spiritual expressions from the early church are still active today.
And when he asked the pastor for guidance on how to navigate this conflict, the pastor simply leaned back and said he wasn't ready for those kinds of questions.
Which is just classic institutional deflection.
Total deflection.
Sure.
So Bob moved on again. He ended up joining a charismatic church where he met a phenomenal musician named Jimmy Bratcher. They formed a band called Unction, and they were playing everywhere. Prisons, the streets, coffee houses. It was vibrant and alive. But then he watched history repeat itself.
He watched the new church go through a very predictable life cycle. It started out wide open, dynamic, and growing organically. But as it grew, the leadership started closing the doors, adding more rigid services, and attempting to manage and control the growth.
Bob noted that anytime you take something dynamic and grab onto it too tightly, you strangle the life right out of it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this introduces one of the most vital philosophies Bob shares in the interview. It's the concept of the organism versus the organization.
Oh, this is such a good framework.
It really is.
Yeah.
Bob argues that the church, or any genuine spiritual community, or frankly any innovative startup or community project, is meant to be a living, breathing organism. It is supposed to interact with its environment, to adapt, to be fertilized by the messiness of real life.
Right.
But the minute it becomes an organization, it begins to die.
Because that transition is so insidious, suddenly preserving the organization supersedes the health of the organism. The focus completely shifts. You stop worrying about the actual people and start worrying about maintaining the building.
Paying the administrative staff.
Exactly. And policing the boundaries of who belongs and who doesn't. The rules become more important than the relationships that start the community in the first place.
Navigating that reality, realizing he was pouring his energy into an organization rather than an organism, eventually led Bob into what he calls a massive dark night of the soul.
Yeah, this was rough.
This hit in the winter of 2009 and into 2010. Now, keep in mind the optics here. At this point, he is the Sunday school superintendent. The pastor had even joked from the pulpit that Bob was in the church building more than he was.
But behind closed doors, Bob lost all hope.
He found himself refusing to even walk out to his mailbox. He was calling suicide hotlines. He was quoting his own dark song lyrics to himself, wondering how a person who wrote those words could want to die.
It is a stark reminder for all of us that institutional involvement, holding titles, and being the person everyone else relies on absolutely does not equate to internal peace.
Not at all. But what pulled him out of this specific dark night is incredibly poignant. A friend of his, who was actively dying of throat cancer, reached out and bought Bob a cup of coffee.
Wow.
This man knew his life was ending, and yet he was the one who managed to give Bob a lifeline. He did this by sparking a profound realization in Bob during this period. He showed him that hope is a container for faith.
Hope is a container for faith. Let's just spend a second on that because it is brilliant.
But I realized that if you have absolutely no hope for the future, your faith simply has nowhere to live. You can know all the literature, hold all the leadership titles, and perform all the right rituals, but without hope, the entire framework collapses.
It just crumbles.
His dying friend provided that container of hope when Bob had completely lost his own.
Thinking about how that applies outside of spirituality, for you listening, you can see it in a career or a relationship. If you are working at a company and you lose all hope that the culture will ever improve or that your work will ever be recognized, your faith in the company completely evaporates.
You stop trying.
You do. You need that baseline container of hope to justify the daily exercise of faith in any system.
To understand how Bob actually climbed out of that 2010 dark place and built a permanent new container for his faith, we actually need to rewind the tape just a bit. We have to go back 2 years to a freezing cold night in January of 2008.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Bob and Flo are at a packed brew pub in Kansas City. It's so incredibly crowded, they are forced to stand at a leaner bar in the smoking section. And they end up sharing this small, intimate space with a young woman named Cordy.
Right.
Cordy is a heavily tattooed, pierced ex-youth worker wearing a slinky black dress, and she is deeply disillusioned with the church.
When Bob casually mentions he's from the same state as a very prominent right-wing conservative politician who was running for president at the time, Cordy unloads.
Oh, she goes off.
She goes on a 5-minute, intense, profanity-laced tirade against this politician and everything she feels he represents.
Now, to be absolutely clear to you listening, we are not taking any political stances here whatsoever. We are completely neutral regarding the political figures mentioned.
Completely neutral.
We are simply relaying Bob's experience and the very raw viewpoint of the person he met that night. Because the politics themselves aren't the point of the story.
The point is the interaction. A typical church leader in Bob's position, facing a tirade like that, might have felt the immediate need to defend his faith, argue the political points, or simply walk away from someone who was actively trying to shock him with stories about her lifestyle.
But Bob didn't do any of that. He let her finish. He listened to the pain underneath the anger. And then he offered this astonishing apology. He looked at her and asked, "Will you forgive me for being part of the generation that hasn't lifted the real Jesus up to your generation?"
Cordy's reaction was immediate. Bob says she grabbed onto him like a life preserver in a hurricane. She told him nobody had ever spoken to her that way before, let alone an older, established religious leader.
It was a moment of total grace.
Completely devoid of any institutional agenda.
Driving home that night, Bob smelled the cigarette smoke from the pub lingering on his sleeve. He held his arm over to his wife, Flo, and said, "That's the smell of the new church we're going to get involved in."
This brewpub experience perfectly illustrates a crucial sociological and theological concept Bob learned from a book called The Shaping of Things to Come. It is the fundamental difference between a bounded set and a centered set.
This analogy is a game changer. Let's really look at how this works.
Think of a bounded set like American ranching. You buy a piece of land, you build a strong, visible fence around the entire perimeter, you herd your cattle inside, and you spend all your time and energy maintaining those borders.
Right, checking the fence lines.
Exactly. Your primary job is to keep the right things in and the wrong things out. This represents traditional, rigid organizations. The boundaries define who is us and who is them.
In a bounded set, your identity is entirely wrapped up in being inside the fence and making sure everyone else knows the rules for entry.
Contrast that with a centered set, which is like the Australian outback. The territory is simply too vast, too wild and too rugged to ever build fences.
You just can't do it.
So instead of building a wall, you dig a deep water hole. You put food around it, and you trust that the right animals will naturally gather around the life source. There are no fences to police. There is only a center to draw people in.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, to reflect on today. Where are the water holes in your own life? Whether you are looking at your career, the way you lead a team at work, your community involvement, or even your family dynamics. Are you spending all your energy policing fences, making sure everyone follows a strict set of behavioral rules?
Or are you creating a space, a culture that naturally draws people in because it provides something life-giving?
Bob realized he'd spent decades policing fences, and he decided it was time to start digging a water hole.
And he practically enacted this concept. For 5 years, he hosted a table every Monday night at McCoy's public house.
5 years.
Yeah, it started with just him sitting there ordering a coffee, and it grew organically into this wildly diverse, messy, beautiful community. We're talking atheists, LGBTQ plus individuals, a transgender woman who became one of his closest friends, Buddhists, deacons, and folks just there to drink.
They would take over a massive table for hours, and Bob had only one rule for this gathering, he said. If you're religious, we'd offend you, but if you were seeking truth, we'd join you.
It was a community built entirely on mutual seeking and genuine relationship. There was no organizational overhead, no membership roster, no doctrine to sign. It was the complete opposite of the systems that had previously strangled his spiritual communities.
His outreach didn't stop at the pub either. He formed a band called the Grateful Saved, which is an amazing name, by the way, and their absolute favorite places to play were inside prisons.
Bringing music to people who were locked behind the ultimate physical boundaries.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He also started a blog called Unheard Words. It was specifically designed to publish the kinds of raw, honest thoughts that would never make it past the editorial boards of mainline church publications.
He even gave the blog a fake Latin motto, San Religio Binus Excrement, which loosely translates to no religious BS.
I love that. And without any marketing budget, without trying to monetize it or build an empire, that blog garnered over 600,000 views from 5 different continents.
Which ultimately proves the point of the centered set. He wasn't trying to build an organization. He wasn't taking offerings, policing a comments section, or preaching formal sermons. He was just faithfully maintaining a water hole, and people around the world who were thirsty naturally found their way to it.
So what does this all mean? When we look at Bob Ingle's massive journey, spanning from the rigid conditional rules of his youth in the 1950s through the institutional burnout and crushing depression of his middle years, all the way to a table full of outcasts at a local pub, what is the core takeaway for us?
Well, Bob mentions in the interview that there are over 45,000 different Christian denominations in the world today.
45,000. Add to that the endless theological debates, the historical schisms, and over 100 different Bible translations. But at the end of the day, after stripping all of that away, the core of true spirituality might just be a relationship.
Bob's final advice to anyone who feels completely overwhelmed by all those choices, or anyone who feels like they are drowning in dogma while desperately searching for actual truth, is beautifully simple. He says, just ask.
Just like he did sitting on the edge of his bed with a borrowed pistol in his hand. No fancy words, just a plea for help.
Or as the author Paul Young also suggests, just ask the Creator to show up in your life. Bob urges people to drop the complicated theology, step away from the organizational requirements, and just ask the question.
Yeah.
But he adds a crucial prerequisite to this. You have to love yourself enough to do this. We are so often taught by institutions to put ourselves last, to view ourselves as deeply flawed or unworthy of direct connection.
Bob reminds us to agree with the fundamental idea that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. You have to actually believe you are worth the answer in order to find the courage to ask the question. Love yourself enough to do this. That is incredibly powerful.
It really is.
Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Bob Ingle's story. It is a brilliant reminder that sometimes the most profoundly spiritual thing you can do is just be a good friend to the messy, complicated person sitting next to you. But before we go, we want to leave you with one final, lingering thought.
A thought that builds directly on Bob's own interpretation of a famous story from the book of Acts, chapter 2.
The traditional story goes that the early believers were gathered together in an upper room, hiding away, and they experienced this incredible divine moment. There was a sound like a mighty rushing wind and what looked like tongues of fire.
But Bob points out something fascinating. The The most important part of that story isn't the miraculous wind or the fire.
The most important thing those people did immediately after experiencing that connection was that they exited the building. They went out into the street, they stopped speaking in insulated religious jargon, and they engaged with the real, diverse world around them.
They went to the people.
They did.
Yeah.
So, we leave you to ponder this. What if the most profound discoveries, the deepest connections, and the truest growth in your own life aren't going to be found by fiercely protecting the rooms you're currently sitting in? What if everything you are searching for can only be found when you finally have the courage to exit the building?